The gunshot that ended her voice echoed beyond the dusty plains of Montana Territory in 1876, following Bridget Taylor like a vengeful ghost as she fled eastward, her soul as silent as her lips. Blood stained her pale blue dress, not her own, but that of her younger brother, Thomas. She'd ridden with him that day, despite her father's warnings about the growing tensions between cattle barons. They were just supposed to check the fence line at the edge of their small ranch. Simple. Safe. They'd stumbled upon 3 men rustling cattle, hired guns working for the wealthy Maxwell brothers who'd been pressing smaller ranchers to sell. Thomas, only 17 and hot-blooded, had confronted them. Bridget remembered reaching for his arm, trying to pull him back. But he'd drawn his pistol too slowly. The shots came fast and he'd fallen, blood pooling beneath him on the dry earth. In blind panic, she'd grabbed his fallen gun and fired. One of the men dropped, his hat tumbling away as he clutched his chest. His eyes had found hers in those final moments, surprised, accusing before emptying of life entirely. She couldn't remember the ride back to town or explaining to the sheriff. Couldn't remember the funeral or the days after. But eventually, the words had simply stopped coming. It wasn't that she couldn't speak. She simply wouldn't. The silence became her penance, her protection, her prison. The last words she'd spoken, "I killed him," hung in the air of Sheriff Monroe's office. Then nothing, for 2 long years. Now, at 22, Bridget moved like a ghost through the small settlement of White Rock Creek in Wyoming Territory, where she'd fled with her father after selling their Montana ranch. Her silence followed her, a constant companion. Nicholas Parker first saw her on a spring morning in 1878, her chestnut hair gleaming in the early sunlight as she arranged fabric bolts in the window of Hargrove's general store. Something about the careful precision of her movements drew his eye. That, and the fact that while most women in town acknowledged him with at least a nod or smile, she never looked up at all. "Who's that?" he asked Tom Hargrove, the store owner, as he paid for his supplies. Tom followed Nick's gaze to the window. "Bridget Taylor. Her and her pa moved here about 6 months back. She works for me 5 days a week. Good worker. Quiet girl. Shy?" Nick asked, trying to sound casual. Tom lowered his voice. "Don't speak. Not a word from what I understand. Some kinda trouble back in Montana. Her pa, Bennett, he's been more forthcoming. Works over at the livery." Nick tipped his hat and stepped outside, pausing to adjust the parcels in his arms. When he glanced toward the window again, he found her watching him, her gray eyes meeting his for just a moment before she quickly turned away. That brief connection stayed with him as he rode back to his ranch, 3 miles outside of town. Nick had come to Wyoming 5 years earlier with nothing but determination and the skills he'd learned working cattle in Texas. At 30, he now had a modest spread, 2 hired hands and a growing herd. What he didn't have was anyone to share it with. Bridget remained in his thoughts for days afterward. It wasn't just her beauty, though she had that in abundance. Something in her eyes had called to him a wounded look that he recognized from his own reflection years ago, after losing his family to fever in Texas. He found reasons to visit Hargrove's store more frequently over the following weeks. Each time, she acknowledged his presence with only the slightest nod, her silence unwavering. He noticed other things, how her hands sometimes trembled when startled by a loud noise, how she flinched at the sound of gunshots when the sheriff practiced his aim behind the jailhouse. One afternoon, a sudden spring thunderstorm struck while Nick was in town. He took shelter on the covered boardwalk outside the general store, watching as sheets of rain transformed the dusty street into a muddy river. The door opened behind him and Bridget stepped out, a small paper-wrapped package in her hands. She seemed surprised to find him there. Headed somewhere? Nick asked, gesturing to the downpour. She glanced at the rain, then held up the package and pointed across the street toward the doctor's office. "Your father's sick?" he asked. She shook her head, then pointed to her own temple, making a small circular motion. "Headache. You have a headache." She nodded, looking somewhat relieved that he'd understood. "This rain won't let up soon. I'd be happy to take that over for you, Miss Taylor." She hesitated, then shook her head, clutching the package tighter. "I understand," he said gently. "A lady's business is her own." Her expression softened slightly, and she offered him the barest hint of a smile before stepping out into the rain, moving quickly across the muddy street. That small smile sustained Nick through the next week. He made inquiries about Bennett Taylor and learned the man had once been a successful rancher in Montana before some trouble forced him to sell. Bennett now worked at the livery, drinking away most of his earnings at Dunford's saloon each evening. Nick introduced himself to Bennett one night, buying the older man a drink. Bennett proved talkative enough after a few whiskeys, though he spoke only vaguely of trouble up north when Nick carefully inquired about their past. "My Bridget, she's a good girl," Bennett said, his voice slurring slightly. "Too good for the hand life dealt her. She ain't always been silent, you know. Used to sing like an angel, now." He trailed off, staring into his glass. "Doctor says there ain't nothing physically wrong with her. Says it'll pass when she's ready." "What happened?" Nick asked quietly. Bennett's expression hardened. "That ain't my story to tell, but I'll say this: she carries blame that ain't rightfully hers." He fixed Nick with a suddenly sober gaze. "I see how you look at her. You seem decent enough, Parker, but my girl's been through enough." "I mean no disrespect," Nick assured him. I'd like to know her better." Bennett studied him for a long moment. "She takes lunch by the creek most days under that big cottonwood, reads her books there, peaceful spot." He drained his glass. "That's all I'm saying on the matter." The next day, Nick rode into town around noon. Sure enough, he found Bridget sitting beneath the cottonwood tree beside White Rock Creek, a book open on her lap. She tensed when she heard his approach, looking up with wary eyes that widened in recognition. "Miss Taylor," he said, dismounting. "I was riding by and saw you here. Hope you don't mind the company." She hesitated, then gestured to the ground beside her, an invitation he gladly accepted. Up close, he could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, the way her eyelashes curled slightly at the ends. "What are you reading?" he asked. She showed him the cover Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. "I've not read it myself," he admitted. "Any good?" She nodded emphatically, a spark lighting her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "Maybe you could tell me about it sometime," he said, then immediately regretted his poor choice of words. But to his surprise, she didn't seem offended. Instead, she reached into her satchel and withdrew a small slate board and chalk. She wrote quickly and turned it toward him. "It's about misunderstandings and pride getting in the way of love." Nick smiled. "Sounds familiar enough. Life's full of misunderstandings, isn't it?" She wrote again. "Why are you here, Mr. Parker?" "Nick," he corrected gently. "And I'm here because I'd like to know you, Miss Taylor." "Bridget," she wrote. Then, after a pause, "Why?" He considered his words carefully. "Because I think there's more to you than meets the eye. Because I recognize someone who's carrying a burden alone, and I know what that's like." She studied him for a long moment before writing. "My burden is not one that can be shared. All burdens can be shared, Bridget. Some just take more time than others." She closed her book and stood, brushing off her skirt. On the slate, she wrote, "I need to return to work." Nick nodded, disappointed but understanding. "May I walk you back to the store?" She hesitated, then nodded once. It became a quiet routine. 3 times a week, Nick would join Bridget by the creek during her lunch hour. Sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence. Other times, she'd write on her slate, answering his questions about her favorite books or asking him about his ranch. He told her about growing up in Texas, about losing his parents and younger sister to fever when he was 22, about working cattle drives before heading north to start his own place. She wrote about growing up in Montana, about her love of horses and the mountains, carefully avoiding any mention of the events that had brought her to Wyoming. Nick never pressed. One day in early summer, he brought her a gift, a journal with a soft leather cover. "Thought you might like something with more space than that slate," he explained. "For longer thoughts." Her fingers traced the tooled leather reverently before she opened it to write. "Thank you. This is the nicest gift I've received in years." "It's just a book," he said, though pleased by her reaction. "It's thoughtfulness," she wrote. "That's rare." As summer progressed, so did their unusual friendship. Nick found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone: his fears about the future, his occasional loneliness, even the nightmares that still plagued him about finding his family dead. Bridget listened without judgment, offering comfort through written words and gentle touches to his hand or arm. By August, Nick knew he was in love with her. He hadn't planned it, hadn't expected it, but there it was. He loved her quiet strength, her thoughtfulness, the way her eyes conveyed what her voice did not. He even loved her silence, understanding it as part of who she was now. Yet he hesitated to speak of his feelings, fearing she might withdraw completely. Instead, he continued their peaceful meetings, content with the gradual softening of her demeanor toward him. The change came on an unusually hot September afternoon. Nick had been delayed by a broken wagon wheel and arrived at their meeting place later than usual. Bridget wasn't there. Concerned, he rode into town to find a commotion outside the saloon. Bridget Taylor was sprawled in the dirt, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. Bridget knelt beside him, her face pale with fear as Doc Wilson examined the wound. "What happened?" Nick demanded, pushing through the gathered onlookers. Sheriff Mills grimaced. "Maxwell's men. 3 of them rode in about an hour ago. Seems they've been tracking Taylor since Montana." Nick felt a chill run through him. Maxwell, the cattle baron from Montana Territory, his brother actually, James Maxwell. Claim is that Taylor's daughter shot and killed their youngest brother 2 years back. They've been looking for her ever since. Nick glanced at Bridget, who was helping her father to his feet. Her face was a mask of controlled terror. "They're still here?" Nick asked, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip. The sheriff nodded. "Drinking at the saloon. Told them I'd need to verify their story before they take any action. Sent a telegraph to the sheriff up in Helena." Nick approached Bridget and her father. "Let me help you get him home." Bennett was unsteady but conscious. "They found us, Bridget," he mumbled. "Those Maxwell bastards found us." "I'll help," Nick insisted, taking Bennett's weight. "Where do you live?" Bridget led them to a small cabin on the edge of town. Once Bennett was settled on his bed, Nick stepped outside with Bridget, speaking in low, urgent tones. "Your father mentioned trouble in Montana. Is this what he meant?" "Did you really shoot someone?" She reached for her journal with trembling hands and wrote quickly. "My brother was murdered by Maxwell's men. I shot one of them, self-defense, but the Maxwells own the law there. Why didn't you explain this to Sheriff Mills?" "I haven't spoken since that day," she wrote, tears welling in her eyes. "My testimony wouldn't matter anyway. The Maxwells want blood." Nick paced the small porch. "We need to get you somewhere safe until this is sorted out." "Where?" she wrote. "They'll just keep looking." "My ranch," he decided. "It's defensible and I have 2 good men there who can help keep watch." She shook her head vigorously, writing, "I won't bring this trouble to your doorstep." "Bridget," he said firmly, taking her hands in his, "I care for you more than care. I won't let them hurt you." Her eyes widened at his near confession, but before she could respond, hoofbeats approached. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the property. Nick recognized James Maxwell from descriptions: a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and cold eyes. His companions were clearly hired guns, their expressions hard and watchful. "Bridget Taylor," Maxwell called out. "We have unfinished business." Nick stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and the cabin. "Mr. Maxwell, I suggest you wait for the sheriff to sort this matter out legally." Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be?" "Nicholas Parker. This is my territory and these people are under my protection." "Your protection?" Maxwell scoffed. "That woman murdered my brother in cold blood. I have the right to see justice done." "Justice is for courts to decide," Nick replied evenly, though his heart hammered in his chest. "Not vengeful brothers." Bridget appeared beside Nick, her face pale but determined. She held out her journal, showing a page to Maxwell. It was self-defense. "Your men killed my brother," Maxwell spat. "Convenient story from a killer who won't even speak to defend herself." He turned to his men. "Search the cabin, bring the girl." "You'll do no such thing," Nick said, his hand moving to his gun. "Leave now, while you still can." The standoff might have ended in bloodshed if Sheriff Mills hadn't arrived with 3 deputies. "That's far enough, Maxwell," he called out. "Just got the telegraph back from Helena. Seems there's more to this story than you let on. The investigation there showed your brother and his men fired first, killed the Taylor boy. The girl was cleared of any wrongdoing." Maxwell's face contorted with rage. "That's a lie." "My brother would never." "I have it in writing from Sheriff Donovan," Mills interrupted. "You're welcome to take it up with him, but you'll do it through proper channels, and you'll do it outside my jurisdiction. I want you and your men gone by sundown." For a tense moment it seemed Maxwell might disregard the law entirely, but eventually, with a venomous glare at Bridget, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't finished," he spat before riding away, his men following. Sheriff Mills approached Nick and Bridget. "They'll be back," he warned. "Maybe not today, but Maxwell isn't the type to let go." "What do you suggest?" Nick asked. "I've asked for additional deputies from the territorial marshal," Mills said, "but they won't arrive for several days. Until then." He looked at Bridget sympathetically. "Miss Taylor, you might consider staying somewhere less obvious." Nick nodded firmly. "She's coming to my ranch. Her father, too, once he's well enough to travel." Mills seemed relieved. "Good. Parker Ranch is defensible and far enough from town to give us warning if Maxwell returns." That evening, Nick brought Bridget to his ranch, setting her up in the spare bedroom while his ranch hands kept watch. Bennett remained in town under Doc Wilson's care, with deputies stationed nearby. The ranch house was modest, but comfortable, a solid log structure with a stone fireplace and sturdy furniture Nick had built himself. Bridget moved through the rooms like a shadow, her shoulders tense, her eyes constantly darting to the windows. "You're safe here," Nick assured her as they sat by the fire after a simple supper. "I promise you that," she wrote in her journal. "I never wanted anyone else caught in this, especially not you." "I'm exactly where I want to be," he told her softly. She stared into the fire for a long moment before writing. "Why? Why risk yourself for someone broken like me?" Nick moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "You're not broken, Bridget. You're wounded, and wounds heal with time and care." He took a deep breath. "And I'm here because I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day in the rain." Tears filled her eyes as she read his declaration. She shook her head slowly, pulling her hands away to write. "You can't love someone who isn't whole." "But you are whole," he insisted. "Your silence doesn't define you. It's just a part of your journey." She closed her journal, tears streaming down her face as she rose and retreated to her room. Nick remained by the fire, wondering if he'd pushed too far, too fast. For 2 days they lived in a strange limbo. Bridget remained mostly in her room, emerging only for meals. Nick respected her need for distance while maintaining vigilant watch for Maxwell's return. No word came from town, except that Bennett was recovering, and the deputies from the marshal's office were expected within the week. On the third night, Nick woke to the sound of breaking glass. He grabbed his rifle and rushed from his bedroom to find Bridget's door already open, her room empty. Panic seized him until he heard movement downstairs. He descended cautiously to find her standing in the kitchen, a broken lamp at her feet. "I'm sorry," she wrote hurriedly in her journal when she saw him. "Nightmares. Couldn't sleep." "It's all right," he said, setting his rifle aside to help her clean up the glass. "I have them too sometimes." When the mess was cleared, they sat at the kitchen table, a single lantern casting soft light between them. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the house, a storm brewing in the distance. "You want to tell me about the nightmare?" Nick asked gently. She hesitated, then wrote, "The same one I always have, Thomas dying, the man I shot looking at me with dead eyes, over and over." "I understand," Nick said. "After my family died, I dreamed of finding them for months, blamed myself for not being there." She looked up at him, her expression questioning. "I'd gone to Austin for supplies," he explained. "When I came back 3 days later, they were already dead from the fever. My mom, my pa, my sister Mary. I buried them myself." He swallowed hard at the memory. "For a long time I thought if I'd only been there, maybe I could have saved them somehow." "Could you have?" she wrote. He shook his head. "No, the fever took half our town. Nothing I could have done would have changed that, but knowing that truth and accepting it are different things. Like knowing I had no choice but to shoot, yet still feeling the guilt," she wrote. "Exactly like that," he agreed softly. They sat in understanding silence for several minutes. Then Bridget began to write again, her pencil moving hesitantly at first, then with growing certainty. "I was 19 when it happened. Thomas was 17. We were checking fence lines when we found 3 men cutting our wire and driving our cattle through. Thomas confronted them. They shot him without warning. I grabbed his gun and fired without thinking. 1 man fell. The others fled. I held Thomas while he died, promising I'd tell everyone what happened. But when I got to town, I couldn't say the words. I just said I killed him to the sheriff, and then nothing more would come. Not then, not after the Maxwell family declared me a murderer, not when we had to sell the ranch and flee. The silence became my punishment, my shield." Nick read her words carefully, his heart aching for her pain. "You were protecting yourself and avenging your brother. There's no sin in that." "I took a life," she wrote. "Even if justified, that weight never leaves." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't, but you don't have to carry it alone anymore." She looked at him with such vulnerability that it took his breath away. She wrote a single question. "Why me? Why would you choose someone with so much darkness?" "Because I see your light," he said simply. "Through all of this, you still care for your father, you still find joy in books, you still show kindness to others. That takes incredible strength, Bridget, and because—" He paused, gathering his courage. "Because when I'm with you, even in silence, I feel at peace for the first time since I lost my family. You make me want to build something new." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she reached across the table to take his hand. For long moments they sat together, fingers intertwined as the storm outside gathered strength. A loud crack of thunder shook the house, making Bridget jump. Almost simultaneously, the front door burst open and Nick's ranch hand, Sam, rushed in. Riders coming, at least 5 of them. Nick was on his feet instantly. "Maxwell, has to be," He checked his rifle. "Sam, get Jake and take positions by the barn. I'll handle things here." As Sam rushed out, Nick turned to Bridget. "Stay upstairs. There's a loaded shotgun in my wardrobe. Barricade the door and don't come out no matter what you hear." She clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear, not for herself, he realized, but for him. "I'll be fine," he promised. "Go now." Reluctantly, she hurried upstairs. Nick extinguished the kitchen lamp and moved to the front window, peering through a gap in the curtains. 5 riders approached through the rain, their figures occasionally illuminated by lightning. He recognized Maxwell at the lead. Nick positioned himself behind the heavy oak table he'd overturned for cover, his rifle trained on the door. Outside, he heard Sam and Jake calling challenges to the approaching riders, followed by Maxwell's angry response. A shot rang out, then another. The front window shattered as a bullet tore through it. Nick returned fire, aiming at the flashes of gunfire visible through the rain. The exchange continued for several minutes, a chaotic symphony of gunfire and thunder. Then, suddenly, silence fell. Nick strained to hear any movement outside, but the pounding rain obscured all other sounds. "Parker," Maxwell's voice called from somewhere to the left of the house. "Send the girl out and the rest of you can live." "That's not going to happen, Maxwell," Nick shouted back. "She killed my brother. Your brother's men killed hers first. The law's already ruled it self-defense." A bitter laugh carried through the storm. "The law? What has the law ever done for men like us? Out here we make our own justice." Nick heard movement on the porch and tensed. The door handle turned slowly. He aimed carefully and fired through the door. A cry of pain told him he'd hit his target. More gunfire erupted outside Sam and Jake, engaging the other riders. Nick kept his position, waiting, listening. Through a gap in the curtains, he saw 2 of Maxwell's men dragging a third back toward the horses. Then the back door splintered open. Nick spun around to see Maxwell himself charging in, pistol raised. Nick fired, but his shot went wide as he was tackled from behind by another of Maxwell's men who'd circled around. His rifle was knocked from his hands as he struggled with his attacker. Maxwell approached, his gun aimed at Nick's head. "Where is she?" he demanded. Before Nick could answer, a voice rang out from the staircase, clear, strong, and feminine. "I'm here." All 3 men turned to see Bridget standing halfway down the stairs, Nick's shotgun in her hands. Her face was pale but determined, her eyes locked on Maxwell. "So the mute can speak after all," Maxwell sneered. "I'm not mute," Bridget said, her voice slightly raspy from disuse but gaining strength with each word. "I chose silence because words failed me after what your brother's men did. They murdered Thomas in cold blood. I did what I had to do to survive." "Liar," Maxwell snarled, swinging his gun toward her. Nick seized the moment of distraction to drive his elbow hard into his attacker's stomach, then lunged for Maxwell's legs. They crashed to the floor together, the gun discharging into the ceiling as they struggled. "Bridget, run!" Nick shouted as he grappled with Maxwell. Instead, she descended the stairs, keeping the shotgun trained on the second man, who was now recovering from Nick's blow. "Drop your weapon," she commanded. The man hesitated, then slowly placed his pistol on the floor. Nick and Maxwell continued their desperate struggle, rolling across the floor, each fighting for control of Maxwell's pistol. Nick managed to slam Maxwell's wrist against the leg of the overturned table. The gun clattered free, sliding across the wooden floor. Maxwell drove his fist into Nick's jaw, momentarily stunning him, then scrambled toward the discarded weapon. Before he could reach it, Bridget's voice rang out again. "Stop or I'll shoot." Maxwell froze, then slowly turned to face her. The shotgun in her hands was steady, aimed at his chest. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain and heavy breathing. "You don't have the nerve," Maxwell said, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "I've killed once to protect someone I love," Bridget said, her voice stronger now. "I'll do it again if I must." The words hung in the air between them. Nick, recovering his senses, moved carefully to retrieve Maxwell's fallen pistol. "It's over, Maxwell," he said, training the gun on the man. "Your men are either dead or fled. The law knows the truth about what happened in Montana." Maxwell's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him as he recognized his defeat. Outside, they heard shouts, more riders approaching. "That'll be the deputies," Nick said. "They must have followed you from town." Minutes later, Sheriff Mills and 4 deputies burst through the door, quickly securing Maxwell and his remaining man. "Everyone all right?" Mills asked, surveying the destruction of Nick's front room. "We're fine," Nick said, moving to Bridget's side. He gently took the shotgun from her trembling hands. "Bridget saved my life." Mills looked at her in surprise. "Miss Taylor, you spoke," she nodded, her voice quiet but clear. "Yes, I found it again when I needed it most." After the sheriff and deputies departed with their prisoners, promising to return in the morning for statements, Nick's ranch hands helped board up the broken windows and door before retiring to the bunkhouse. The storm gradually subsided, leaving behind a peaceful quiet punctuated by the gentle patter of diminishing raindrops. Nick built up the fire in the hearth while Bridget made coffee. They sat side by side on the sofa, exhausted but too keyed up to sleep. "Your voice," Nick said softly. "It's beautiful," she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "It feels strange to use it again, like exercising a muscle that's been idle too long. What made you break your silence?" Her hand found his, fingers intertwining. "You. When I saw him about to shoot you, I realized that some things are worth speaking for. That staying silent wasn't protecting me anymore, it was just keeping me from truly living." She paused. "From truly loving." Nick's heart swelled. "Did you mean what you said, about protecting someone you love?" "Yes," she whispered. "I love you, Nicholas Parker. You sat with me through my silence, never demanding words I couldn't give. You protected me when you barely knew me. You saw past my brokenness to who I could be again." He drew her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. "You were never broken, Bridget, just waiting to heal. And you were patient enough to wait with me," she murmured against his shoulder. "I would have waited forever," he told her honestly. She pulled back enough to look into his eyes. "You don't have to wait anymore." Her lips met his in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened into something more profound, a promise, a beginning. When they finally parted, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "What happens now?" she asked. "Whatever we want," he said. "Maxwell will stand trial. Once that's settled, we can decide our future. Together." "Together," she repeated, the words sounding like a prayer. "I'd like that." They remained by the fire until dawn broke, talking softly. Bridget's voice grew stronger with each hour, though she spoke carefully, thoughtfully, a habit formed from years of holding her words inside. She told him about Thomas, about her childhood in Montana, about her dreams before tragedy had intervened. Nick shared stories of his own cattle drives in Texas, his journey north, his hope of creating something lasting on his Wyoming ranch. As morning light filtered through the damaged windows, Nick took her hands in his. "Marry me, Bridget. Not right away, we can wait until you're ready. But I know what I want, and it's you by my side for all the days to come." Tears shimmered in her eyes as she squeezed his hands. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes." 6 months later, after Maxwell's conviction and sentencing, they were married in the small church in White Rock Creek. Bennett, now sober and working as Nick's foreman, proudly walked his daughter down the aisle. When the minister asked Bridget to speak her vows, her voice rang out strong and true, filling the church with promises of love and faithfulness that brought tears to many eyes. Their life together unfolded like the pages of one of Bridget's beloved books, not without challenges, but rich with love and purpose. The ranch flourished under their combined care. Bridget started a small school for the children of nearby ranchers. And when their first child was born a year later, they named him Thomas, in memory of the brother whose life had set them on their path to each other on warm summer evenings. They would often sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant hues. Sometimes they spoke of their plans and dreams. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, a silence not of pain or guilt, but of peace and contentment. And sometimes, when the moment was right, Bridget would sing softly to their son, her voice carrying across the land they called home the voice that had returned in the arms of a patient cowboy, who had loved her through her silence and into speech once more.